Victoria Jackson was a 22-year-old party girl, struggling to overcome the pains of her youth.
She seemed kind of wild and out there, a wild child.
She found a kindred spirit in Trey Jackson, a 24-year-old survivor from the mean streets of Chicago.
He'd been shot 9 times in a gang shootout.
Their bond grew into a red-hot romance. And their luck changed when one of their family members married a millionaire lottery winner.
$20 million.
This was a game changer. It felt like her and her family had hit the jackpot.
But what seemed like good luck would turn out to be a deadly curse.
There is a dead body in the car.
Now, go inside the case with detectives as they follow a bloody trail of lies, deception, and abuse. A trail that would lead to multiple suspects, expose a family's dark secrets, and ultimately end in murder.
As more details came out, it really became like a soap opera. You could not imagine this to be true.
It was just after 8 p.m. in Tampa, Florida, when a neighbor knocked on the front door of a local resident, James Ruffalo. The neighbor told James that he'd just seen something strange. 3 teenagers abandoning a van on a street in their neighborhood.
It was definitely peculiar as to why they would just leave a van there and just take off.
The neighbor said he wanted to investigate the van and asked James to follow as backup. When they approached the van, the 2 men were unable to see through its darkened windows. The back door, though, was unlocked, and nothing could have prepared them for the horror of what they found inside.
There was a black male bound face down in the middle of the van with head trauma.
James and his neighbor immediately called 911.
911, what's your emergency?
We have a homicide. There is a dead body in the car.
But who was this dead man? Who had killed him? To answer those questions, police would have to unravel a twisted web of jealousy and greed, and lay bare a motive so shocking, it left even the most seasoned investigators reeling.
It was crazy how the story started to unfold.
Victoria Jackson grew up the youngest of 3 sisters in a poor family on Chicago's West Side. And while they didn't have much, Victoria did have a close and loving relationship with family, especially her 2 older sisters, Crystal and Terry.
We were swimming in the pool with her, playing in the backyard, playing ball.
But her peaceful home life would change when Victoria turned 15. Her older sisters had both moved out of the house, and a family tragedy scarred young Victoria forever.
She comes home from school one day. The house is unusually quiet. Her parents aren't home. Seems very strange to her, so she starts looking around.
Victoria made her way to the garage, where she made a horrifying discovery.
Her father hung himself in the garage.
No one knew or understood why Victoria's father killed himself. But the suicide had a profound effect on a once happy and cheerful teenager. She grew sullen and withdrawn and began fighting with her mother. Not long after her father's funeral, Victoria decided to move out on her own. She spent the next few months crashing with friends and sleeping on couches. But it wasn't long before her oldest sister, Crystal, stepped in to help. Crystal had recently gotten married, and she and her new husband invited Victoria to come live with them. Victoria was grateful for Crystal's help and spent the next few years living with her sister and new brother-in-law. But Victoria still bore the scars of her traumatic youth. She was hanging out with a rough group of friends and getting into trouble.
She was like doing drugs and drinking and, kind of just being a wild, uncontrolled, girl.
Victoria's wild reputation drew the attention of several equally troubled young men from her neighborhood. One was a handsome and tough 20-year-old named Nathaniel Trey Jackson, who would soon turn Victoria's life upside down. Like Victoria, Trey Jackson had been touched by tragedy at a young age.
He'd been through some things that would have broken some other people. As a child, his house caught on fire and he barely survived.
By the time he was a teenager, he was hanging out with a dangerous crowd. And he'd earned a reputation on his street as someone not to be messed with.
He was very manipulative and very controlling, but also having this extreme rage.
Over the next few years, Trey had repeated run-ins with the law. He also had several run-ins with local street gangs, including a time when he was almost killed in a shooting.
Trey was shot 9 times in the crossfire of a gang shootout.
Trey was rushed to the hospital for emergency surgery and miraculously survived. Having already cheated death twice in his short life, Trey felt nothing could stand in his way. And his bad boy image also made him irresistible to women.
This is a guy that had walked through the hail of gunfire and he'd come out the other side. This was like catnip for the girls on the street.
One of the girls who hung around Trey and his friends was pretty 18-year-old Victoria Jackson. When they met through mutual friends, they felt an immediate attraction. Victoria was turned on by Trey's strength and tough reputation, while he was drawn to her wildness and sexuality.
You could tell the two instantly connected with one another.
Within a few weeks, the couple were inseparable. Their bond over their tragic pasts intensified their romance, which helped distract Victoria from the pain of her childhood. And the more time she and Trey spent together, the more obsessive and fiery their relationship became.
They understood each other in a way that no one their age could possibly understand. Victoria was head over heels in love with this guy. Trey felt the same way about her.
But once again, it seemed fate had other plans for Victoria Jackson. Just a few months after Victoria and Trey met, her sister Crystal and her new husband offered to move Victoria and their other sister Terry with them to Florida. The idea was for the entire family to start over in sunny Tampa. Victoria's brother-in-law told her if she came with them, she could have her own apartment.
He invited Victoria to come down and told her he would take care of her.
So she's got a pretty tough choice to make. One choice is she's got Trey in Chicago. The other one is a pretty sweet life down in Florida.
After years of struggling to survive, the promise of being completely protected and supported by her brother-in-law was too great a chance to pass up. So Victoria reluctantly left a budding romance with Trey behind to follow her brother-in-law and sisters to Florida. Tampa offered Victoria a fresh start and a shot at a normal life.
She has a wonderful brother-in-law that's enabling her to have a life, to be able to work part-time, go to school, have some luxuries at that time that a young person would want.
But as good as her new life was, Victoria couldn't stop thinking about Trey. And when she reached out to him, she found out he felt exactly the same way.
Trey had been heartbroken when she left. She was the girl that got away.
After a few months, Trey decided he couldn't stand being apart from her any longer.
Trey calls up one day and asks if he comes down to Florida, could he shack up with her in her apartment? She thought this was incredibly romantic that he would move all the way across the country for her.
Trey showed up on Victoria's doorstep the next day, and the lovers immediately picked up where they'd left off.
So Trey moved into Victoria's apartment, and it didn't take very long at all before they were spending every waking moment they had together.
Victoria couldn't have been happier. She finally had both the man she adored and the love and support of her family. But little did anyone then know that a tragedy was just around the corner. Coming up, the identity of the body in the abandoned van unveils a likely motive.
When a man worth $10 million turns up dead, the first person police are going to look at is the wife.
After overcoming childhood tragedies, Victoria and Trey Jackson were in the midst of an intense and passionate romance in Tampa, Florida. The lovers also had the financial support of Victoria's family. everything seemed perfect. But in 2005, a series of shocking events would unfold that would test the limits of the young couple's love. On the evening of July 26th, the local sheriff's department responded to a 911 call. 2 residents had reported an abandoned van in their neighborhood, and they found an even more disturbing discovery inside.
They discovered there was a deceased male inside.
The victim was a black man in his late 30s.
He was face down and his hands out in front of him.
There's a bullet hole on top of his head.
But who had killed this man? And why had his body been left inside a van on this quiet neighborhood street? When detectives questioned the residents who called police, they learned that one of the 2 men had actually witnessed the van being abandoned.
One of the neighbors told police that he was looking outside his window, saw a van parked outside his home. 3 teenagers jumped out and fled the scene. He described them as being possibly 2 black females and 1 black male.
While officers looked for the 3 suspects, CSIs pored over the vehicle for evidence that might identify the victim or the killers. The search yielded little in terms of forensics, but a decal on the van's exterior gave police their first clue.
It's a conversion van. There was a sign on the side of it that said Cassie's Popcorn Shop.
And when detectives cross-referenced the company name and the van's registration, they ID'd the murder victim.
The owner of the van was a Jeffrey Dampier. We look at his driver's license photo, and obviously it was him that was in the van.
As soon as investigators heard the name, they realized they had more than just a random killing on their hands. Jeffrey Dampier wasn't just a local businessman. He was also well known around town as a multi-million-dollar lottery winner. Jeffrey Dampier was born in 1966 and raised on the west side of Chicago. A hard worker, Jeffrey served in the Army and studied auto mechanics. But his main passion was his family.
He was involved with everything that we did. He was very family-oriented.
And the lives of Jeffrey and his family changed forever in 1996, when he and his first wife, Deborah, bought tickets for the Illinois lottery. It was a day neither of them would ever forget.
We usually go to church on Sunday, so I can get all the kids ready for church. And I checked the number. I'm like, I got these numbers. And we was telling the kids, y'all, we rich.
Jeffrey and his wife had hit the $20 million jackpot, which meant a new life full of hope and opportunity for their family. Jeffrey quit his low-paying job and gave his family all of the things he'd never been able to provide for them.
I remember the change, I guess I called it. We went right into having this huge house and having all these things.
News of his massive lotto winnings made the married family man quite popular around town, especially with a number of beautiful young women who weren't shy in letting Jeffrey know that they wanted to be with him. And it hadn't been long after he hit the jackpot that Jeffrey gave in to temptation.
He started having affairs, several of them, and it wasn't long before his wife found out.
Eventually, Jeffrey and Deborah decided to get a divorce.
It was amicable. They decided to split the money evenly and to share custody of their children.
Jeffrey was now a single millionaire, but he didn't live a swinging bachelor's life for long. No sooner had the ink on the divorce papers dried than he was introduced through mutual friends to a pretty young woman from Chicago's West Side. Her name was Crystal Jackson. Jeffrey's family told police that he and Crystal shared an instant chemistry. And Jeffrey took an immediate liking to Crystal's 2 younger sisters, 17-year-old Terry and 15-year-old Victoria. So when Jeffrey and Crystal got married, it wasn't surprising when Jeffrey decided to use his millions to help his wife's family.
This was a game changer for the Jackson family. It seems like they'd always been poor. So for Crystal to now be dating a millionaire, it felt like her and her family had hit the jackpot.
Jeffrey also tried to step in and be a surrogate father figure for young Victoria, following the suicide of her and Crystal's father.
Jeffrey and Victoria had a very unique and strong bond.
Then in 2002, Jeffrey told Crystal he wanted to move to sunny Tampa, Florida.
He liked the summertime, so he wanted to stay somewhere it was always hot. He just wanted to move to a beautiful place and, just live there for the rest of his life.
But Jeffrey didn't want to make Crystal leave her sisters behind. So Jeffrey offered to pay for Victoria and Terry to move to Florida with them.
He was extremely generous with his money. He bought a house in a very nice, suburban community and took care of the other sisters right in the same neighborhood so the sisters could be together.
It was an amazing opportunity for all three of the Jackson sisters, though for young Victoria, there was one downside.
Victoria had to leave her boyfriend Trey behind in Chicago. But then he moved to Florida and everyone was happy.
Once settled in Florida with Crystal and her sisters, Jeffrey decided to use a small part of his lotto winnings to open a modest Chicago-style popcorn shop.
He called it the Cassie's Popcorn Shop, which he named it after his granddaughter. He employed his family members. He just tried to take care of everybody.
The store was a hit. It wasn't long before Jeffrey and his popcorn shop became a big part of the community. But as homicide detectives were now learning, not everyone in town must have been a fan of Jeffrey Dampier, as evident from the tragic and violent way in which he was murdered. But who would want Jeffrey Dampier dead? When police spoke to his children, they hadn't mentioned any problems or enemies that their father might have had. But since Jeffrey was a well-known millionaire, police detectives couldn't help but suspect that the person most likely to benefit from Jeffrey's death was the woman who stood to inherit his fortune.
When a man worth $10 million turns up dead, the first person police are going to look at is the wife who stands to inherit all that money. $10 million is a huge motive.
You always go into it as everybody's a suspect. Could she have had a role in his death?
To find out, detectives decided to visit Crystal at the couple's home. But they held back on telling her that her husband was dead. Instead, the detectives claimed they were simply trying to locate Jeffrey in regards to an ongoing investigation. Crystal appeared alarmed to learn her husband was missing and told police the last time she'd spoken to Jeffrey had been earlier that evening.
He called and told his wife, "Don't wait up on him." He said he was going to meet his children out for dinner at a restaurant, but he never showed up at that restaurant like he had planned.
Was Crystal telling the truth? Detectives decided to check her phone records, and her story appeared to hold up.
There were records of tons of calls from Crystal's phone to Jeffrey's, but each one went to voicemail. It was clear she was trying to reach him, and she couldn't.
The information she was providing us was accurate.
With Crystal eliminated as a suspect, detectives finally informed her that Jeffrey had been murdered. Crystal was devastated. Choking back her tears, she told police she had no idea who would want to hurt her generous husband.
He had no enemies. It was just really a shock.
With Crystal at a loss as to who might have wished Jeffrey harm, investigators appeared to be at a dead end. But later that evening, not far from the crime scene, Tampa police happened to drive up on a person that would change the course of the investigation.
As detectives were leaving the Dampier home, dispatch notified them that a patrolman located someone with inside information into Jeffrey's murder.
They were in custody of a female who needed to be interviewed as a potential witness or possibly somebody involved.
Coming up, an eyewitness tells a harrowing tale of kidnapping and murder.
And I looked back over the seat. It was blood just pushing out his head. I looked back in there.
Victoria and Trey Jackson's passionate romance had been overshadowed by tragedy. When Victoria's wealthy brother-in-law, Jeffrey Dampier, was found shot to death in his abandoned van.
You just don't see that every day. To have a lottery winner that's abducted and then killed, that's definitely unique.
An eyewitness had seen a young man and two women fleeing the scene of the crime. And less than an hour later, patrolmen picked up one of the female suspects.
She was walking down Broadway Avenue when one of the deputies pulled up and said, "Hey, this could be one of the subjects."
The woman said her name was Terry. She seemed visibly upset, and when police brought her in for questioning, Terry claimed she was just out walking after a fight with her boyfriend.
She said they were arguing, and at one point it got so heated that she just left the apartment and just started walking.
Terry's story seemed reasonable at first, but then she stunned detectives by asking if she could make a phone call to her sister, Crystal Dampier.
Terry's last name is Jackson. She's the sister to Victoria Jackson and Crystal Dampier. This makes her the sister-in-law to the victim, Jeffrey Dampier.
Detectives immediately realized that Terry's claims suddenly sounded a lot more suspicious.
Her being located nearby and now learning that she is the sister to Crystal, obviously red flags are being raised.
When investigators pressed Terry about her story, she quickly broke down and admitted the truth. She confessed that she was in the van when Jeffrey Dampier was murdered, and that she could identify the killers. According to Terry, the events that led up to her brother-in-law's murder had started earlier that evening when she went to visit her youngest sister, Victoria, at her apartment. As she fought through tears, Terry explained what time she arrived at the apartment and who was there.
And what time was that? It had to be about 7 o'clock.
And who was there?
Me and Vicky and Trey.
What's Trey's real name?
Nathaniel Reginald Jackson.
But Terry said Trey didn't stay long. Shortly after she arrived, he left, leaving the sisters in the apartment by themselves to watch a movie. But before they settled onto the couch, Victoria told Terry she needed to take care of something with their brother-in-law, Jeffrey.
Terry said Victoria surprised her by picking up the phone and calling their brother-in-law, Jeffrey, to ask him to come over so he could lend her some money. Jeffrey had been paying for Victoria's expenses since she moved down to Florida. Now she's on the phone saying she's run out of money. She needs more cash to pay for her bills for the month.
Jeffrey told Victoria over the phone that he'd swing by the apartment with more money in a few minutes. Victoria then did something that caught Terry off guard.
She asked Terry to hide in the other room when Jeffrey came over so that he didn't know she was there.
That was really strange to her because Jeffrey was her brother-in-law too. She asked, "Why do you want me to hide?" But Victoria was insistent, so she hid in the bathroom, not really knowing why.
To make her sister happy, Terry decided to excuse herself to the bathroom when Jeffrey knocked on the door. From the bathroom, she listened while Victoria and Jeffrey talked in the living room. But after a few minutes, she said she heard arguing. Curious as to what was going on, Terry decided to investigate and walked in on a shocking scene.
She goes back into the living room and quickly sees it's not Victoria and Jeffrey having an argument, it's Trey. And Trey is pointing a gun at Jeffrey.
Nathaniel has immediately at gunpoint, starts demanding money from him, demands his car keys.
It's obvious to Terry that Victoria lured Jeffrey to the apartment so Trey could rob him, and that she wanted her to hide in the bathroom so she wouldn't see the robbery take place.
Terry told police that she was shocked by Trey and Victoria's behavior, and she immediately tried to leave and contact police. But Trey wouldn't let her go.
He was right there with the guns, and I was like, well, I don't want no part of this, let me go. You ain't going nowhere.
And to make sure Terry did as she was told, Trey issued a grave warning.
That's when he threatened me in my life, in my child life.
Terry said she felt like she had no choice but to follow Trey's instructions. Under the threat of gunpoint, he ordered her to help Victoria tie Jeffrey up. But that's when Jeffrey revealed something that shocked and infuriated both Trey and Victoria. Despite the fact that Victoria had asked Jeffrey on the phone to bring money to her apartment, he claimed he didn't have any cash on him.
Jeff was like, man, I give you whatever you want. I don't have no cash on me. All I got is my credit card. Every time my credit card, my wife won't report it stolen.
But Terry said Trey wouldn't listen, and he told Jeffrey he'd better come up with something better than credit cards if he didn't want to get shot.
Jeffrey is worried that Trey is about to shoot him, so he offers him all the money he keeps in a safe at the popcorn shop and that seems to calm him a little.
So like, what you got in that safe? What you got in the safe? He like, I got about 10,000, 15,000.
Terry told investigators that Trey ordered everyone to get in Jeffrey's van. Terry said Victoria drove while Trey kept Jeffrey at gunpoint. And the whole time, Jeffrey was pleading for his life.
There was a lot of yelling and screaming in the van. Nathaniel striking Jeffrey. Jeffrey's screaming.
But after a few minutes, Terry said that Trey told Victoria to pull over and made his true intentions clear. Trey wasn't only after Jeffrey's money. He wanted to kill him.
He get a gun to Vicky. Trey say, get in the back. Get all the way in the back. So I get all the way in the back because I don't want to die. Vicky turn around and she holding a gun.
Trey hands the gun to Victoria and tells her to shoot Jeffrey.
Trey never cared about the money. He just wanted to convince Jeffrey to get in the van, so he made him think they were going to rob him. His real motive was to kill Jeffrey, and he was ordering his girlfriend to do it.
But although Victoria had seemed fine with the plan to rob Jeffrey, Terry said she was reluctant to shoot her brother-in-law, which made Trey even angrier.
He just starts screaming at Victoria to shoot him. Shoot him, shoot him, shoot him. And eventually, Victoria does succumb to the pressure of him screaming at her, and she shoots Jeffrey and kills him.
I heard pop. And then when I looked back over the seat, it was blood just pushing out his head. I looked back his head.
Terry told police that once Jeffrey was dead, Trey pulled into a residential neighborhood and stopped the van. Trey then searched Jeffrey's body and discovered that Jeffrey had lied about not having any money on him. There were several $1,000 and $100 bills in Jeffrey's pockets. Terry said Trey and Victoria split the money and then began discussing what they should do with the body. And that's when she finally saw her chance to escape.
Once the van slowed down, she was able to open the van door and get out.
She takes off running as fast as she can and doesn't stop until the police pick her up a few miles down the road.
It was a shocking story, but detectives couldn't help but wonder, if Terry really had nothing to do with the murder, why didn't she tell them the truth to begin with?
She lied right from the beginning. If she was a true victim and she was part of this incident, she wouldn't have made up this lie.
There were other details that also bothered detectives. If Terry had also been abducted as she claimed, then why hadn't she been tied up along with Jeffrey? Why hadn't she called 911 once she escaped from Trey and Victoria? And perhaps the biggest question of all, why would Trey want to kill Jeffrey Dampier in the first place?
Jeffrey was supporting Victoria. He was giving her money for her apartment where she and Trey lived. Police couldn't figure out if he was supporting them, what would be Trey's motive to kill Jeffrey?
To answer those questions, police knew they needed to find both Trey and Victoria. But Terry insisted she didn't know where the couple had gone. Was Terry telling the truth? Or was she holding back and guarding a dark secret that would expose the real reason why Trey and Victoria had targeted Jeffrey Dampier for murder? Coming up, investigators discover the disturbing truth behind Jeffrey's relationship with Victoria.
He was more than just Victoria's brother-in-law.
But to catch his killers, police will have to put another man's life in danger.
Not knowing what was going on. If he was going to be coming to my house, he would kill somebody else.
Victoria and Trey Jackson were a pair of young lovers living together in an apartment her millionaire brother.
Same thing for Nathaniel, too.
But after Jeffrey was found murdered, police had picked up Victoria's sister Terry as a suspect. And she pointed the finger at the two lovers. Terry also suggested that the true motive behind the crime hadn't been robbery. Instead, she claimed that Trey's desire to kill Jeffrey had sprung from a disturbing revelation about Jeffrey's relationship with Victoria. It seemed that while Jeffrey provided for his wife's family, he also expected something from Victoria in return.
Jeffrey kind of stood in as a kind of a father figure, but kind of took advantage of that situation. This whole time there was a relationship on the side.
He was giving Victoria money and paying for her living expenses, but he expected sex in return. He and Victoria were having a secret affair behind Crystal's back.
So Jeffrey was having an affair with your sister, Vicky?
Trey had learned about the affair from Victoria, and that's why he wanted to kill Jeffrey. He was mad that Jeffrey was having an affair with his girlfriend.
Terry said she didn't know how Trey had found out about Victoria and Jeffrey's relationship, but she did know how long Victoria and Jeffrey had been sleeping together. Terry told police that the 39-year-old had been having sex with her sister for the last 7 years.
That meant he pressured her into sleeping with him when she was just a child.
He started having a sexual relationship with her when she was only 15 years old. He manipulated her into having sex with him. He was a man with deep, dark secrets.
Apparently, Victoria felt like she had to sleep with Jeffrey, or he'd quit supporting her. She confided in Terry about the affair, but the two sisters had both kept the awful secret from Crystal for years.
Until Trey found out, only 3 people knew about the affair: Jeffrey, Victoria, and Terry. And Terry said keeping this relationship a secret had really taken a toll on her own relationship with Victoria.
It obviously caused, a lot of angst between the 3 of them.
Even though Terry denied taking part in the murder, it wasn't hard to believe she could have been willing to help Trey put an end to her brother-in-law's sexual abuse. But just how involved was Terry? To determine the truth, investigators needed to track down Victoria and Trey. Investigators immediately put out a bolo alert for the couple. Soon, all of Florida was on the lookout for the fugitive lovers.
We got with the local media, plastered their information on all the news channels, and passed it along throughout the state to see if we can come in contact with them.
More than likely, they're still going to be together.
For 2 days, investigators searched for the missing lovers, while the murder headlined the local news. The media attention paid off when Jacksonville police received a panicked phone call from one of Trey's cousins, a man named William Berry, who said he'd recently heard from the couple.
It was the first time that they made contact.
It was Thursday evening, 2 days after, I guess, this incident.
Did he call you or he come by and visit?
He called me and said he needed to talk to me about some things.
William told police that Trey and Victoria were currently hiding out in Jacksonville. They needed a car to get them to Chicago. And he'd just gotten a call from Trey, who said he was coming over to William's house that afternoon.
Nathaniel got on the phone and I was like, "What's up?" I didn't let him know that I knew what was going on. He was like, "Well, I'll just talk to you when I get there."
Knowing that his cousin was wanted for murder, William immediately called police. Detectives were thankful William risked his own safety to help catch the killers, but they asked if he'd be willing to do even more.
Police told William to wait at home so Trey wouldn't suspect anything, so he was there when it all went down.
William agreed to act as bait. When Trey showed up at his home later that afternoon, William greeted him on the doorstep. That's when officers swarmed the house. They found Victoria sitting in a borrowed car.
Victoria and Trey were both arrested of first-degree murder of Jeffrey Dampier.
They were just as calm as could be. When they were arrested, they just surrendered.
Police found what little remained of the stolen money in Trey's pocket, $1,500 in blood-stained bills. But when investigators sat down to question Victoria, they were shocked to learn her version of events was vastly different from the story they'd just gotten from her sister. To detectives' surprise, Victoria didn't admit to her affair with Jeffrey, and she insisted she had nothing to do with the attack on Jeffrey. The way Victoria told it, she was the innocent bystander, and Terry was the one working with Trey.
Trey and my sister come out the room. My sister had a knife, and Trey had the gun. And they told him not to move, sit down or whatever.
Victoria said she realized her sister and boyfriend were attempting to rob Jeffrey, and she agreed to help because she didn't want to anger them. But when they were all in the van, Victoria said Trey handed her the gun and shocked her by demanding that she shoot Jeffrey.
He started yelling, "Vicky, do it, Vicky, do it."
Victoria insisted to police that she didn't want to kill her brother-in-law, but she was terrified of what Trey would do if she refused.
I just closed my eyes and turned my head and pulled the trigger.
It was a surprising story, but police suspected Victoria was trying to downplay her own culpability in the crime. Trey seemed to do the same thing when he spoke to detectives. Despite contrary statements from both Terry and Victoria, Trey at first tried to deny any knowledge of Jeffrey's murder, until investigators decided to shake things up and brought Victoria into his interview room to surprise him.
Victoria told him they already know, so he stopped and thought for a minute and said, "So be it."
Realizing he was cornered, Trey finally admitted to planning the robbery, but he was adamant his motive was strictly financial, not personal.
He never mentioned a motive about Victoria's affair with Jeffrey. He really was just after the money.
But after Victoria had left the room, Trey contradicted her story and told detectives that he didn't order his girlfriend to shoot Jeffrey. Instead, Trey claimed the shooting had been an accident.
He denies telling Vicky to shoot Jeffrey. He denies telling her to shoot him.
But who was telling the truth? Trey, Victoria, or Terry? Authorities determined it would be best to let a jury decide and arrested all three suspects on suspicion of murder. Coming up, a jury decides which sister they believe, Terry or Victoria. And will Victoria and Trey continue to stand by each other as they face life in prison? Or will they try to save themselves?
She was cold, calculated. She knew exactly what she was doing.
When Victoria and Trey Jackson reignited their fiery romance in Tampa, Florida, the star-crossed lovers thought nothing would ever keep them apart again. But their passionate reunion had come to a shocking end when they were arrested for the kidnapping and murder of Victoria's secret lover, her millionaire brother-in-law, 39-year-old Jeffrey Dampier.
As more details came out, it really became like a soap opera. You could not imagine this to be true.
Victoria stood trial first. Prosecutors focused their case on the cold, hard facts of her confession. Despite her claims that Trey had coerced her, Victoria had admitted she was the one who pulled the trigger. They also called her sister Terry to the stand, who'd taken a plea deal to testify against Victoria and Trey. From the witness stand, Terry told the courtroom that it was Victoria who'd set the trap for Jeffrey the day he was killed, when she asked him to come by her apartment that afternoon to bring her more money.
The prosecution painted it as that she was cold, calculated, she's a murderer. She lured him to her apartment. She knew exactly what she was doing.
Prosecutors also reminded the jury that Jeffrey Dampier had given Victoria and her co-conspirators every opportunity to spare his life, but she'd shown no mercy.
Begging, pleading for his life, saying, I'll give you whatever you want. But yet they still put him in that van, and they still shot him.
When it came time to present their case, Victoria's defense insisted that she hadn't committed the crime of her own free will. Years of psychological trauma had left her easily manipulated by Trey, who was hell-bent on revenge after learning that Jeffrey was sleeping with his girlfriend.
The defense said Victoria was a victim in life. Her father killed himself at an early age, and now Nathaniel is forcing her to do things that she doesn't normally do.
To many in the courtroom, it seemed like it would be hard for the jury not to sympathize with Victoria's plight. But in the end, it wouldn't be enough to earn her an acquittal.
The jury was only out for a short period of time and came back with a guilty verdict.
6 months after Victoria's conviction, Trey Jackson's trial began. His defense continued to insist that Trey only planned to rob Jeffrey Dampier and that he had no idea that Victoria was going to shoot him.
His home defense was that, yeah, I was there, but I didn't do it.
But Trey's defense turned out to be no match for Florida law.
That felony murder rule means if you're committing a felony and somebody dies in the process, you're just as culpable as a person who pulled the trigger.
Even if he hadn't have screamed at her to kill him, he assisted and helped organize and commit the crime of robbery, which eventually led to Jeffrey's death.
After brief deliberations, the jury found Trey guilty of all charges. Jeffrey Dampier's killers had been brought to justice. But given the disturbing allegations that had been raised against the victim, it was hard for many to get satisfaction from the verdicts.
She was only 15 years old when she entered into a relationship with her sister's husband. He manipulated her into having sex with him. She was a victim in this, too.
How many people did H.H. Holmes actually kill? It is one of the most persistent questions in American true crime, and perhaps one of the most difficult to answer with certainty. For more than a century, the name H.H. Holmes has been associated with a 3-story building in Chicago that became known as the Murder Castle, with stories of hidden passages, sealed rooms, gas lines, trapdoors, and victims disappearing into its walls. Newspapers helped turn Holmes into a figure almost larger than life, and later retellings expanded the story even further, sometimes claiming that he murdered more than 100 people, perhaps even 200. But beneath that mythology is a more complicated and more troubling reality. The strongest evidence does not establish 200 victims. It does not even establish that every strange feature attributed to the building was designed for murder. What it does establish is that Herman Webster Mudgett, the man who became H.H. Holmes, was a practiced fraudster who eventually became a convicted murderer, and that several people connected to him disappeared under circumstances that remain deeply disturbing. To understand the case, it is necessary to begin before the castle, before the World's Fair, and before the newspapers gave Holmes his most infamous identity. Herman Webster Mudgett was born in New Hampshire in 1861. He would eventually abandon that name and adopt another, H.H. Holmes. The new name was more than a change of identity. It became part of the persona he presented to the world. Holmes had studied medicine at the University of Michigan and graduated in 1884. His education gave him knowledge of anatomy and human remains, knowledge that would later become relevant to his fraudulent activities. But his criminal career did not begin with a killing. It began with deception. Holmes became involved with false identities, forged documents, property schemes, insurance fraud, and other methods of exploiting the trust of other people. He showed particular interest in life insurance and in the possibility of using bodies in fraudulent claims. The distinction matters because it changes the way the story is understood. The popular image of Holmes is that of a murderer who first constructed a building specifically designed to kill. The available information suggests something more gradual and more calculated. Holmes was already learning how to manipulate people, money, identities, and institutions before the most serious accusations against him emerged. Fraud was not a side detail in his story. It was part of the foundation. Around the middle of the 1880s, Mudgett arrived in Chicago and began using the name H. Holmes. Chicago was undergoing enormous growth. The city was expanding, attracting people from different places, and preparing for an event that would transform it into an international destination. The World's Columbian Exposition of 1893, commonly known as the Chicago World's Fair. Holmes saw opportunity in the city. He acquired a pharmacy in the Englewood area and then purchased property opposite it. On that property, construction began on a 3-story building. In later years, that building would become famous as the Murder Castle. Yet even the name itself needs to be treated carefully. The building's reputation grew through a combination of Holmes's own activities, the suspicions surrounding people connected to him, and sensational reporting after his crimes were exposed. The traditional story describes the structure as an elaborate killing machine. Rooms that could supposedly be sealed, secret corridors, trapdoors, gas lines, hidden passages, and basement facilities intended for the disposal of bodies. Some accounts presented the building almost as though Holmes had designed it from the beginning as a private factory for murder. But not every part of that story can be established as fact. Modern historical accounts have emphasized that newspapers in 1895 greatly exaggerated the image of the building. Even the idea that it operated as an ordinary hotel has been questioned. Holmes promoted the property in connection with the World's Fair, but the building did not necessarily function in the simple way later stories suggested. Its unusual construction may also have been connected to Holmes's commercial fraud. He reportedly used different groups of workers, changed personnel, and exploited suppliers for materials without properly paying them. In other words, some of the building's confusing and incomplete construction may have reflected financial deception rather than a perfectly organized murder plan. This uncertainty is essential. It does not make Holmes less dangerous. It simply separates the documented criminal from the legend that grew around him. In 1893, the World's Columbian Exposition opened in Chicago. The event brought enormous numbers of people into the city. There were tourists, workers, young women seeking employment, temporary residents, merchants, and visitors who had traveled far from their homes. Holmes existed in a world where people were constantly arriving and leaving, and where a missing person might not immediately attract the attention that a disappearance would receive in a smaller community. His appearance and education could help him present himself as a respectable and trustworthy man. That image would become important because several women connected to Holmes later disappeared. One of the names associated with him was Julia Connor. Julia worked at Holmes's pharmacy and had a relationship with him. She also had a daughter, Pearl. Around the end of 1891, Julia disappeared. Holmes later provided explanations about what had happened, but those explanations were contradictory. One account associated her death with an abortion, but the circumstances remain uncertain. That uncertainty matters. It would be easy, looking backward from Holmes's eventual conviction, to treat every disappearance connected to him as proof of murder. But the available evidence does not allow that conclusion to be made with certainty. Another woman associated with Holmes was Emmeline Sigrand. She worked for him and later disappeared. Holmes was suspected of having some connection to her disappearance, but the historical evidence does not establish exactly what happened to her. Then there were sisters Minnie and Nanny Williams. Minnie was particularly important in Holmes's life because she possessed property and had financial connections that could benefit him. Holmes had a romantic relationship with Minnie, and the two were involved in property transactions. Eventually, both Minnie and Nanny disappeared. Objects believed to be associated with Minnie were later reportedly found around Holmes's building. Yet once again, suspicion is not the same as proof. These women should not be reduced to a list of names used to support a serial killer legend. They were people whose lives intersected with Holmes and whose disappearances became part of the mystery surrounding him. The most important turning point in the story, however, would involve a man named Benjamin Pitzel. Unlike many of the names later associated with Holmes, Pitzel's death became the center of a criminal prosecution. Pitzel was a business associate of Holmes in fraudulent activities, particularly insurance fraud. Their plan was supposed to involve a false death. Pitzel would appear to have died, and another body would supposedly be used to convince an insurance company that the death was genuine. Holmes could then help facilitate the collection of insurance money. It was a scheme based on deception, but the plan went catastrophically wrong. Pitzel did not merely disappear. He actually died. Holmes attempted to present the death as a suicide or as part of the planned fraudulent arrangement. But there was a crucial problem. Pitzel was genuinely dead, and Holmes could still benefit from the insurance arrangement. That fact transformed the nature of the case. What had been a fraudulent scheme now contained a real death. In 1894, Holmes was arrested in connection with fraud, and investigators increasingly connected him with Pitzel's death. But even then, the full extent of the case had not yet emerged. The most disturbing development was still to come. After Benjamin Pitzel died, 3 of his children, Alice, Nellie, and Howard, disappeared. Holmes had control over information about their movements and told the family that the children were safe. They were not. Investigator Frank Geyer began following the trail left by Holmes. The search would move through different locations and eventually lead to Toronto. There, in July 1895, the bodies of the children were discovered. The discovery destroyed the possibility that the case could be dismissed as a simple insurance fraud or an isolated death. The children were gone, and the man who had been connected to their movements was H. Holmes. From that point forward, the investigation would move steadily toward the courtroom. The building in Chicago would become famous. The newspapers would tell stories of a murder castle. Claims about dozens, then hundreds, of victims would circulate. But the central case against Holmes was more precise than the legend. It concerned a dead man named Benjamin Pitzel, 3 missing children, and a trail of deception that investigators had begun to reconstruct piece by piece. The question was no longer simply who H. Holmes claimed to be. The question was what he had actually done. And as investigators followed that trail, the difference between the man and the myth would become increasingly important. By the time Herman Webster Mudgett began using the name H. Holmes in Chicago, he had already learned something fundamental about deception. A convincing identity could be more valuable than the truth. A name could open doors. An educated manner could create confidence. A respectable appearance could make people less likely to question what happened behind closed doors. Chicago offered Holmes an environment in which that kind of identity could flourish. In the middle of the 1880s, the city was changing rapidly. It was expanding, attracting people from different parts of the country, and preparing to become the center of international attention. Holmes arrived at a moment when the city itself seemed to be built around movement and opportunity. For someone who understood how to exploit other people's trust, it was an ideal setting. He established himself in the Englewood area, acquiring a pharmacy and then purchasing property directly opposite it. On that property, construction began on a 3-story building. In later years, that structure would become one of the most notorious locations in American true crime. It would be called the Murder Castle. But when the building was being constructed, there was no sign bearing that name. There was no public declaration that it was intended to become a place of murder. The name came later, after Holmes's crimes had been exposed and newspapers began constructing a terrifying narrative around the building. That distinction is important because the building's actual history is considerably more complicated than the legend. The popular image of the Murder Castle is almost impossible to separate from the stories that followed Holmes's arrest. According to the most sensational versions, the building was designed as a sophisticated killing machine. It supposedly contained secret corridors, concealed passages, rooms that could be isolated, trapdoors, gas lines, and other mechanisms that allowed Holmes to control people who entered. Some accounts described rooms without windows and facilities in the basement that could supposedly be used to dispose of human remains. Over time, these details became so closely associated with Holmes that they were repeated as though every one of them had been established beyond doubt. But the evidence does not support such certainty. Modern historical accounts have emphasized that newspapers in 1895 exaggerated many aspects of the building. The sensational press had a powerful incentive to turn Holmes into a uniquely terrifying figure, and the strange appearance and construction of his property provided ideal material. The building itself was certainly unusual, and investigators later found suspicious material associated with it. But an unusual building is not automatically proof of a murder complex, nor does every room, corridor, or construction irregularity demonstrate that Holmes intended to kill people there. This is where the distinction between evidence and mythology becomes essential. Holmes was a fraudster before he was publicly known as a murderer. His activities included deception involving insurance, identities, documents, property, and financial arrangements. The building therefore existed within a wider pattern of commercial manipulation. Holmes reportedly used different groups of workers during its construction and changed personnel. He also exploited suppliers, obtaining materials without properly paying for them. A structure that was incomplete, confusing, or strangely arranged could therefore have resulted from Holmes's fraudulent business practices as much as from any alleged plan to murder. The later image of a perfectly engineered murder castle can make Holmes appear almost impossibly methodical. But the reality presented in the available information is less neat. Holmes was a man who repeatedly used deception to create opportunities for himself, and the building was part of that world. It became the physical symbol of his reputation only after the investigation into his crimes had begun. Chicago itself added another layer to the story. The city was preparing for the World's Columbian Exposition of 1893, an enormous event that would attract visitors from many places. When the exposition opened on May 1st, 1893, Chicago became even more crowded with temporary residents, travelers, workers, merchants, and people seeking opportunities. For Holmes, this environment created access to strangers and provided a setting in which people could arrive and disappear without immediately becoming part of a tightly connected community. That does not mean that every person who vanished from Chicago during the World's Fair became a victim of Holmes. There is no evidence supporting such a sweeping conclusion. But the transient nature of the city formed an important background to the cases that later became associated with him. Holmes could present himself as an educated and respectable man. His medical education reinforced that image. He had graduated from the University of Michigan in 1884, and his knowledge of anatomy and human remains became relevant to the fraudulent activities attributed to him. To people who did not know his history, the combination of education, confidence, and apparent respectability could create an impression of trustworthiness. That impression would matter enormously in his relationships with the people around him. Among those people were women whose lives became entangled with Holmes and whose later disappearances contributed to his legend. Julia Connor worked at Holmes's pharmacy and had a relationship with him. She also had a daughter named Pearl. Around the end of 1891, Julia disappeared. Holmes later gave explanations concerning what had happened, but those explanations were contradictory. One account connected her death with an abortion. Yet the available evidence does not establish the circumstances with enough certainty to state exactly what happened. That uncertainty should remain part of the story. The fact that Holmes would eventually be convicted of murder does not automatically transform every unexplained disappearance associated with him into a confirmed homicide. Another woman connected to Holmes was Emmeline Sigrand. She worked for him and later disappeared. Holmes was suspected of having some connection to her disappearance, but the evidence available here does not establish her fate conclusively. Then there were Minnie and Nanny Williams. Minnie had property and financial connections that made her relationship with Holmes significant. Beyond the personal level, Holmes became romantically involved with her, and the two were connected through property transactions. Eventually, both sisters disappeared. Objects believed to be associated with Minnie were later reportedly found around Holmes's building. Those circumstances strengthen suspicion, but they still do not provide the same level of proof that exists in the Benjamin Pitezel case. The distinction between these cases would become increasingly important once investigators began to examine Holmes's activities more closely. The women connected to Holmes represented one part of the mystery. The building represented another. And the newspapers would eventually combine the two into a single narrative: the mysterious doctor, the strange castle, and the missing women. But the case that would finally bring Holmes into direct conflict with the law did not begin with the building. It began with money. Holmes's criminal activities had always involved opportunities to profit from deception. Insurance was particularly attractive because a person's death could be converted into a financial claim. Holmes understood that if a death could be made to appear genuine, the resulting insurance payment could provide a source of money. That logic eventually brought him into closer association with Benjamin Pitezel. Pitezel was a collaborator in fraudulent schemes, and together they developed an insurance plan based on the idea that Pitezel would appear to have died. A different body was supposed to be used to convince the insurance company that the death was real. Holmes would then assist in obtaining the insurance money. The plan depended upon control over identity, control over evidence, and control over the story that would be told to the insurance company. But instead of remaining a carefully constructed fraud, the plan ended with a genuine death. Benjamin Pitezel was actually dead. Holmes attempted to present the death as a suicide or as part of the fraudulent arrangement. But the circumstances increasingly drew suspicion. The central contradiction was impossible to ignore. The man whose death was supposed to be staged had genuinely died, while Holmes still stood to benefit from the insurance arrangement. In 1894, Holmes was arrested in connection with fraud. Investigators increasingly connected him to Pitezel's death, and the investigation began to move beyond financial deception. Yet even then, the full scope of what had happened had not been revealed. Holmes's most disturbing secret would emerge through the disappearance of 3 children. Alice, Nellie, and Howard Pitezel were connected directly to the man whose death had become the center of the investigation. After Benjamin Pitezel died, the children disappeared. Holmes maintained that they were safe and controlled information about where they were being taken. But investigator Frank Geyer began following their trail. Each location Holmes had used became another piece of the investigation. The search eventually reached Toronto, where the bodies of the children were discovered in July 1895. Their deaths transformed the case. The story could no longer be reduced to an insurance scheme gone wrong. There were now multiple dead members of the Pitezel family, and Holmes was connected to the movements of the children before their deaths. The investigation was approaching its most important stage. The building in Chicago would soon become the symbol of Holmes's crimes. But the evidence that mattered most in court would come from a different place and from a different kind of relationship. It would come from the trail connecting Holmes to Benjamin Pitezel and his children. And as Frank Geyer continued tracing that trail, the man who had spent years constructing identities and manipulating other people's trust was approaching the moment when his own identity would be exposed. By the time Chicago was preparing for the World's Columbian Exposition of 1893, H. Holmes had already built something more important than a strange 3-story building. He had built an identity. He was no longer simply Herman Webster Mudgett, a man from New Hampshire with a history of deception. In Chicago, he was H. Holmes, educated, confident, apparently respectable. and capable of presenting himself to other people as someone they could trust. That identity mattered because Holmes's relationships were rarely based on a single purpose. Money, property, employment, romance, and deception often existed alongside one another. And when people who had become connected to him later disappeared, the circumstances created suspicion that would follow Holmes for the rest of his life. Yet this is also where the story becomes difficult to separate from its mythology. The popular version of Holmes's story presents every disappearance connected to him as another murder. The historical record does not allow such certainty. Some people disappeared under circumstances that remain deeply suspicious. Some were associated closely with Holmes, but the evidence is not equally strong in every case. That distinction is essential, because the mystery surrounding Holmes has often been allowed to overshadow the people themselves. One of the earliest names associated with him was Julia Connor. Julia worked at Holmes's pharmacy, placing her within his professional environment and within the world he was constructing around himself. She also became romantically involved with him. Her daughter, Pearl, was part of that relationship as well. Around the end of 1891, Julia disappeared. The disappearance immediately became significant in later accounts of Holmes because it fit the emerging pattern of people who had been close to him and then were no longer seen. Holmes provided explanations concerning what had happened, but those explanations were contradictory. One version connected Julia's death with an abortion. Yet the circumstances surrounding her disappearance were never established with the same certainty that would later exist in the prosecution of Benjamin Pitezel. That uncertainty is not a minor technicality. It changes how the case must be told. Holmes would eventually be convicted of murder, and that conviction makes it tempting to look backward and treat every unexplained disappearance as evidence of another killing. But suspicion created by hindsight is not proof. Julia Connor should therefore remain in the category of a suspected victim rather than a confirmed one. The same caution applies to her daughter Pearl. Their names became part of the Holmes story because of their connection to him and because of what happened after they disappeared. But the available evidence does not allow the circumstances to be stated with absolute certainty. Another woman who became connected to Holmes was Emmeline Sigrand. She worked for him, which placed her in a position of proximity and dependence similar to that of other people who entered his orbit. Then she disappeared. Holmes was suspected of being connected to her disappearance, but again, the evidence does not establish precisely what happened. There is an important pattern here. Holmes did not necessarily need to threaten people openly in order to make himself dangerous. His relationships could place other people in circumstances where their movements, employment, finances, or personal decisions became connected to him. When one of those people disappeared, investigators and the public were left trying to reconstruct what had happened after the fact. The absence of certainty became part of the mystery. But the most significant relationships among the women associated with Holmes involved two sisters, Minnie and Nanny Williams. Minnie Williams was particularly important because her connection to Holmes was not only personal. She possessed property and had financial interests that made her valuable to a man whose activities repeatedly involved money and deception. Holmes developed a romantic relationship with Minnie, and the two became connected through property transactions. That relationship created another possible avenue through which Holmes could benefit from the trust of someone close to him. Minnie was not simply an employee or casual acquaintance. She was someone with whom Holmes had both personal and financial connections. Her sister Nanny was also drawn into the same circle. Eventually, both sisters disappeared. Their disappearance became another major element in the later accusations against Holmes. Objects believed to be associated with Minnie were reportedly found around the area of Holmes's building, adding to the suspicion surrounding her fate. But even here, the historical record requires restraint. The disappearance of Minnie and Nanny is deeply suspicious, and Holmes's relationship with them provides reasons for investigators to examine him closely. Yet the evidence does not justify presenting their deaths as established facts in the same way as Benjamin Pitzel's murder. The distinction between suspicion and proof becomes especially important when considering the extraordinary victim counts later attached to Holmes. Newspaper accounts eventually suggested that Holmes had killed enormous numbers of people. Holmes himself contributed to the confusion by making statements that claimed responsibility for numerous deaths. But if every disappearance connected to Holmes were automatically counted as a murder, the number could expand almost without limit. That is one reason the legend became so much larger than the evidence. Each unexplained disappearance could be added to the story. Each strange circumstance could be interpreted as part of the same pattern, and the building in Chicago could become the supposed center of everything. But the real investigation eventually turned on a different relationship, one that produced evidence strong enough to lead directly to a murder conviction. That relationship was between Holmes and Benjamin Pitzel. Pitzel was not simply an acquaintance. He was a collaborator in fraudulent schemes. Holmes and Pitzel were particularly interested in insurance fraud, and their activities demonstrate how Holmes's criminal methods operated before the case became a murder investigation. Their plan involved creating the appearance of Pitzel's death. The intention was to use another body to convince an insurance company that Pitzel had actually died. If the deception succeeded, Holmes could assist in obtaining the insurance money. The scheme depended on the manipulation of identity and evidence. A body would be presented as belonging to Pitzel. The insurance company would be persuaded that a legitimate death had occurred, and money would follow. But the plan did not unfold as intended. Benjamin Pitzel actually died. That single fact changed everything. Instead of an entirely fraudulent death staged for financial gain, there was now a genuine corpse and an insurance policy that could potentially produce money. Holmes attempted to explain the death in ways that reduced his responsibility. The death was presented as a suicide or as something connected to the planned fraud. But the central contradiction remained: Pitzel was truly dead, while Holmes could still benefit financially from the insurance arrangement. The distinction between a staged death and an actual killing became the central issue investigators would have to resolve. By 1894, Holmes was arrested in connection with fraud. Investigators were increasingly examining his relationship with Pitzel and the circumstances of the man's death. But then another development transformed the case. 3 of Benjamin Pitzel's children disappeared. Their names were Alice, Nellie, and Howard. Holmes had information about where the children were being taken and told the family that they were safe. That assurance would become one of the most troubling aspects of the case because the children were not simply lost. Their movements were connected to Holmes. He had the ability to direct where they went and to control the information available to those searching for them. This created a new investigative problem. It was no longer enough to determine what had happened to Benjamin Pitzel. Investigators now had to locate 3 children who had been placed under Holmes's control. The task fell heavily upon investigator Frank Geyer. Geyer began tracing Holmes's movements and reconstructing the route taken by the children. The investigation became a pursuit across different locations, with each place Holmes had used potentially providing another piece of the puzzle. Geyer followed that trail until it reached Toronto. There, in July 1895, the bodies of the children were discovered. The discovery marked a decisive turning point. Whatever uncertainty remained about Julia Connor, Pearl, Emmeline Sigrand, Minnie Williams, or Nanny Williams, the deaths of the Pitzel children created a much stronger connection between Holmes and multiple victims. The children had disappeared after their father's death. Holmes had controlled information about their whereabouts. Frank Geyer had followed their trail. And then their bodies were found. The case could no longer be treated simply as an insurance fraud in which someone had died. Unexpectedly, there were now multiple deaths connected to the same chain of events. The investigation had become a murder case. It was also at this stage that the distinction between Holmes's real crimes and the later legend surrounding him became increasingly important. The newspapers would soon focus heavily on the strange building in Chicago. The name Murder Castle would become attached to Holmes. Reports would describe hidden rooms and terrifying mechanisms, and the public would begin to imagine a vast killing operation hidden behind respectable walls. But the evidence that mattered most to the prosecution did not depend on proving that Holmes had murdered hundreds of people inside that building. The case against him was becoming much more concrete. It involved Benjamin Pittesel, whose death could be tied directly to Holmes's fraudulent plans, and the 3 Pittesel children, whose disappearance and deaths could be traced through the route Holmes had controlled. Frank Geyer's investigation had transformed a collection of suspicions into a chain of evidence. And as that chain grew stronger, Holmes's ability to control the story began to weaken. For years, he had relied on names, explanations, promises, and carefully constructed appearances. Now investigators were reconstructing what happened without relying on his version of events. The man who had spent so long controlling information was approaching a moment when the evidence would begin speaking for itself. The next stage would be the courtroom, where Holmes would attempt one more time to control the narrative, and where the question would become not how terrifying the legend of the murder castle had become, but whether the evidence was sufficient to prove that H. Holmes had murdered Benjamin Pittesel. By the time investigators began examining the death of Benjamin Pittesel, H. Holmes was already an experienced fraudster. For years, deception had been central to the way he operated. He used names that were not his own, manipulated documents, became involved in property schemes, and showed a particular interest in insurance. These activities were not simply background details to the Holmes case. They were the mechanism through which he came into contact with the people who would later become victims or witnesses, and they provide the clearest context for understanding what happened to Benjamin Pittesel. Holmes did not need to begin with murder. He already understood how to make money by convincing other people to believe something that was not true. An insurance policy offered another opportunity. If a person's death could be made to appear genuine, money could potentially be collected without the insurer understanding what had actually happened. Benjamin Pittesel became involved with Holmes in this world of fraud. The 2 men were associates in fraudulent activities, particularly a scheme involving life insurance. The original plan was based on a false death. Pittesel was supposed to appear to have died, while another corpse would be used to persuade the insurance company that the person who had died was actually Pittesel. Once the deception was accepted, Holmes could help facilitate the collection of the insurance money. It was a plan that depended on controlling information. The identity of the body had to be accepted. The circumstances of the supposed death had to appear convincing, and the people involved had to maintain the same story long enough for the insurance process to succeed. But something went fundamentally wrong. Benjamin Pittesel did not merely disappear. He actually died. That single fact transformed the entire scheme. What was supposed to be a fraudulent death became a genuine death, and Holmes remained connected to the financial arrangement that could benefit from it. The distinction between an insurance fraud and a murder investigation, therefore, became increasingly difficult to ignore. Holmes attempted to explain Pittesel's death in a way that would protect the original scheme. According to the information available in the case, he tried to present the death as a suicide or as something that had occurred as part of the fraudulent plan. But the circumstances raised questions. If Pittesel had really died, then someone had to explain how and why. And if Holmes still stood to receive or facilitate the insurance money, the financial motive became increasingly significant. The central problem for Holmes was that a plan designed around deception had produced a real corpse. The person whose identity was supposed to be manipulated was actually dead, and the man who had been involved in arranging the fraudulent claim remained at the center of the circumstances. In 1894, Holmes was arrested in connection with fraud. The arrest did not immediately resolve every question surrounding Pittesel's death, but it placed Holmes in a position from which investigators could begin examining his wider activities. The case was no longer simply about an individual who had committed a fraudulent act. Investigators were beginning to see connections between Holmes, Pitzel, insurance money, and the unexplained movements of people associated with them. Then the investigation took a more disturbing turn. 3 of Benjamin Pitzel's children disappeared. Their names were Alice, Nellie, and Howard. The disappearance of the children changed the emotional and investigative character of the case. These were not business associates involved in a fraudulent arrangement. They were children who had become connected to Holmes through their father. Holmes controlled information about where they were going and told the family that they were safe. That assurance would become deeply significant because it placed Holmes in a position of responsibility for their whereabouts. If the children were safe, as Holmes claimed, then there should have been a clear explanation for where they were. But instead, their movements became increasingly difficult to reconstruct. Holmes had taken control of the story, and investigators now had to determine whether that story was true. The task of following the children's trail fell to investigator Frank Geyer. Geyer's role became one of the most important parts of the investigation because the search required more than examining a single location. Holmes had moved the children through different places, leaving behind a trail that had to be reconstructed piece by piece. Each location became a possible link between what Holmes had said and what had actually happened. Geyer followed that trail across jurisdictions, eventually reaching Toronto. There, in July 1895, the bodies of the children were discovered. The discovery was devastating because it destroyed the most important part of Holmes's explanation. The children were not safe. They were dead. The investigation had now reached a point where Holmes could no longer rely solely on the original insurance scheme to explain what had happened. Benjamin Pitzel was dead, and his children were dead. Holmes had been connected to the fraudulent arrangement involving their father, and he had controlled information concerning the children's movements. The discovery of the bodies, therefore, created a much stronger chain of evidence than the rumors surrounding the Chicago building. It also made the question of motive more complicated. The case was no longer only about whether Holmes wanted insurance money. Investigators had to determine why the children had disappeared and what role Holmes had played in their deaths. This distinction became critical when the prosecution eventually focused on Benjamin Pitzel. Holmes would not be placed on trial for every disappearance associated with him. The central criminal case concerned Pitzel's murder. The stories surrounding the murder castle were becoming increasingly sensational. But the prosecution required something more concrete than newspaper claims. It needed evidence that could be presented in court. Holmes's history of fraud provided context. His association with Pitzel provided the relationship. The insurance scheme provided a possible financial motive. Pitzel's death provided the central event. And the subsequent disappearance and deaths of the children demonstrated that Holmes's involvement with the Pitzel family extended beyond the moment when Benjamin died. The investigators, therefore, had to separate what could be proven from what was merely suspected. This was particularly important because Holmes's name was already becoming attached to other unexplained disappearances. Julia Connor had disappeared. Emmeline Sigrand had disappeared. Minnie and Nanny Williams had disappeared. These cases were disturbing, and Holmes's relationships with the women created reasons for suspicion. But none provided the same direct path to a criminal conviction as the Pitzel case. If prosecutors wanted a successful murder prosecution, they needed to establish what happened to Benjamin Pitzel and demonstrate Holmes's responsibility for it. The death of Pitzel, therefore, became the center of the case. The investigation also exposed one of the most significant characteristics of Holmes's criminal behavior: his reliance on controlling the story. The insurance scheme required him to create a false reality. Pitzel was supposed to appear dead when he was not. A different body was supposed to be accepted as his. Money was supposed to change hands based on that deception. But when Pitzel actually died, Holmes continued trying to maintain control over the explanation. He could no longer simply manufacture a fictional identity for the dead man. He had to explain a real death. And then he had to explain why Pitzel's children were no longer where they were supposed to be. Every new explanation created another opportunity for investigators to test his story against physical facts. The discovery of the children's bodies was therefore more than a tragic development. It was an investigative breakthrough. It gave Geyer and the other investigators something Holmes could not simply explain away by changing a name or altering a document. The children were dead, and the route Holmes had taken them could be traced. Their deaths turned the investigation into a search for the truth behind his carefully constructed explanations. By 1895, Holmes's situation had changed dramatically. The man who had spent years creating identities and manipulating people was now facing a case built around evidence that could not easily be controlled by his words. The Chicago building might become the most famous image associated with him, but the path to his conviction was being constructed elsewhere. It was being constructed through the death of Benjamin Pitzel, the insurance scheme that preceded it, the disappearance of 3 children, and Frank Geyer's determination to follow the trail Holmes had left behind. The investigation was no longer asking whether Holmes was simply a fraudster who had allowed a fraudulent scheme to go wrong. It was asking whether the death at the center of that scheme had been deliberate. That question would eventually be placed before a jury in Philadelphia. And when Holmes entered the courtroom, he would attempt to do what he had done throughout much of his life: control the narrative, redirect suspicion, and persuade other people to accept his version of events. But this time he would have to convince a jury. The evidence against him was no longer scattered rumors about a strange building or unexplained disappearances. It was a specific death, a specific financial scheme, and a trail that investigators had painstakingly reconstructed. The man who had once profited from deception was now facing the consequences of a deception that had produced something he could not make disappear. Benjamin Pitzel's death. The death of Benjamin Pitzel had already transformed the case against H. Holmes. But the disappearance of Pitzel's children would make the investigation far more disturbing. Benjamin Pitzel had been connected to Holmes through fraudulent activities and an insurance scheme. His death had created questions about whether a planned deception had become an intentional killing. But now 3 children connected to Pitzel were missing. Their names were Alice, Nellie, and Howard. Unlike the adults who had surrounded Holmes through business, property, or personal relationships, these children had not been partners in his schemes. Their connection to him came through their father. Holmes had information about where they were being taken, and he assured the family that they were safe. Those assurances became increasingly difficult to accept as investigators attempted to determine where the children had gone. The case had now entered a new phase. It was no longer enough to investigate a dead insurance associate. Investigators had to locate 3 missing children and establish whether Holmes's statements about them were true. The responsibility for following that trail fell heavily upon investigator Frank Geyer. His investigation would become one of the most important parts of the entire Holmes case because it required patience, reconstruction, and a willingness to follow the trail across different locations. Holmes had not left the children in one obvious place. Their movements had to be traced through the places connected to him. Each location became another piece of the puzzle. Each piece had to be considered in relation to what Holmes had said. The investigation, therefore, became a test of his story. If the children were safe, as Holmes claimed, then their whereabouts should eventually be explained. If his statements were false, the trail would have to reveal where the truth had been hidden. Geyer followed the trail beyond Chicago. The investigation eventually led him to Toronto. This was an important development because it demonstrated how far the children had been moved from the places where their father had been connected to Holmes. The search was no longer confined to the environment surrounding the so-called murder castle. The case had become a broader investigation into Holmes's movements and the people who had been placed under his control. In July 1895, Geyer's search reached its most terrible conclusion. The bodies of the children were discovered in Toronto. The discovery changed the case permanently. Holmes's assurances that the children were safe could no longer be accepted. They were dead. The investigation now had physical evidence of the children's deaths. Rather than simply reports that they were missing, their deaths also created a direct and deeply troubling connection between Holmes and the Pitzel family. Benjamin Pitzel was dead. His children had disappeared after his death. Holmes had controlled information about their whereabouts, and investigators following the route connected to Holmes had found their bodies. The sequence was difficult to dismiss as coincidence. Yet even at this stage, it remained necessary to separate what could be proven from what was suspected. The discovery of the children did not automatically answer every question about how they died or precisely what Holmes had done. It did, however, destroy the explanation that they were safe. That alone was a major breakthrough. For investigators, the significance of Geyer's work was not simply that he had found the children. He had reconstructed a trail that Holmes had attempted to keep hidden. Holmes's methods depended heavily on controlling information. He could provide one explanation to one person and another explanation elsewhere. He could move people and then assure others that everything was normal. But physical locations could be compared with his statements. The trail could be followed independently of what he claimed. This was one of the weaknesses in Holmes's system of deception. A false story can survive when nobody checks it against reality. But once investigators begin checking each statement against each location, contradictions become visible. The children were one of those contradictions that could no longer be concealed. Their discovery also changed the nature of Holmes's legal situation. The case was no longer primarily an investigation into insurance fraud. The fraudulent scheme involving Benjamin Pitzel had created the original suspicion. But the deaths of the children demonstrated that the consequences of Holmes's actions extended beyond the insurance arrangement. The investigators now had to consider a chain of events involving multiple deaths. This was particularly significant because Holmes had been associated with other disappearances. Julia Connor and her daughter Pearl had disappeared. Emmeline Sigrand had disappeared. Minnie and Nanny Williams had disappeared. These cases remained surrounded by suspicion, but they did not carry the same evidentiary weight as the Pitzel case. The children were different because their bodies had been found after Holmes had controlled their movements. The investigation, therefore, had to distinguish between the cases that could be strongly connected to Holmes and those that remained uncertain. This distinction would become crucial when Holmes eventually stood trial. The public would hear stories about the strange building in Chicago. Newspapers would describe secret rooms and terrifying mechanisms. Holmes would become associated with an enormous number of alleged victims. But a courtroom required something more precise. The prosecution needed to establish a specific crime. The discovery of Alice, Nellie, and Howard Pitzel gave investigators a devastating part of the larger story. But the murder charge that would ultimately determine Holmes's fate centered on Benjamin Pitzel. The children's deaths nevertheless became an essential part of understanding what Holmes had done, and how he had attempted to maintain control after Pitzel's death. The investigation into the children also revealed the importance of persistence. Holmes had moved them through different locations, and every movement created another obstacle for anyone trying to find them. Geyer had to reconstruct a journey that had been obscured by Holmes's explanations. The fact that the search eventually reached Toronto demonstrated that the investigation could not be limited to one city or one building. The murder castle had become the center of public fascination, but the actual investigation extended far beyond its walls. That difference would become one of the most important lessons of the case. The building was a powerful symbol, but the evidence against Holmes came from people, movements, financial arrangements, and deaths. It came from following what Holmes had actually done rather than accepting the story surrounding him. The discovery in Toronto also had a profound human significance. Alice, Nellie, and Howard were no longer missing children whose family could hope that they might still be found alive. Their disappearance had ended in death. Whatever remained uncertain about the exact circumstances, the investigation had established the worst possible truth. For the people who had been searching for them, This was not a chapter in a famous criminal story. It was the loss of 3 children. Their names would later become part of the Holmes legend, but before they became evidence in a notorious murder case. They were members of a family whose lives had already been devastated by Benjamin Pitzel's death. The discovery of their bodies, therefore, gave the investigation an emotional weight that could not be reduced to legal arguments. Holmes's actions had created a chain of suffering that extended beyond the original financial scheme. By the summer of 1895, investigators had assembled a much clearer picture of the danger surrounding Holmes. He had been involved in fraud. Benjamin Pitzel was dead. 3 of Pitzel's children had disappeared and were subsequently found dead. Holmes had been connected to their movements, and other disappearances involving people close to him remained unresolved. The case was now moving toward Philadelphia, where Holmes would face trial. There, the central question would be narrower than the legend that had already begun to surround him. The jury would not be asked to decide whether Holmes was responsible for every disappearance ever associated with his name. It would be asked to determine whether he was responsible for the murder of Benjamin Pitzel. Holmes, however, would have to confront something he had spent years avoiding, a story that was no longer entirely under his control. Investigators had followed his trail. Frank Geyer had found the children. The evidence had become more concrete, and the courtroom would provide the next test. Could Holmes still persuade people to believe his explanations when the facts had already begun to contradict them? The answer would determine whether the man who had built his life around deception would leave the courtroom free to continue it, or would face the ultimate punishment for Benjamin Pitzel's death. By the summer of 1895, the investigation surrounding H. Holmes had changed from a collection of suspicions into a case with a growing body of evidence. Benjamin Pitzel was dead. His 3 children, Alice, Nellie, and Howard, had disappeared after his death and were later found dead in Toronto. Holmes had been connected to the movements of the children and had provided assurances that they were safe. Investigator Frank Geyer had followed their trail and uncovered the truth. Yet the investigation still had to answer a crucial question. What could actually be proved against Holmes in a courtroom? The public was becoming fascinated by stories of the strange building in Chicago. But investigators could not rely on newspaper descriptions or rumors. They had to establish a specific crime and connect Holmes to it through evidence. That distinction became increasingly important as the investigation turned back toward Chicago and the building that would eventually become known as the Murder Castle. By this point, Holmes's reputation had begun to grow beyond the facts that could be established. Newspapers described a structure filled with hidden spaces and frightening mechanisms. Stories circulated about rooms designed to isolate victims and methods supposedly used to dispose of bodies. The building became the physical symbol of Holmes's alleged crimes. But investigators had to determine what was actually there. When the building was examined, authorities reportedly discovered suspicious material, including human remains and other objects that raise questions. The information available in this case records that police discovered 2 graves in the basement of the building in July 1895. Such discoveries were obviously disturbing, but they did not automatically establish the existence of a vast killing operation. Identifying human remains from incomplete or damaged material was difficult, and the available evidence did not prove that dozens or hundreds of people had been murdered inside the building. This was one of the moments when the difference between investigation and sensational journalism became especially important. A suspicious discovery could generate a headline. A criminal conviction required something more. Holmes's building was strange, but the strongest case against him continued to center on Benjamin Pitzel and the Pitzel children. The investigation, therefore, had to proceed on 2 separate levels. First, authorities had to determine whether Holmes had committed murder. Second, they had to establish the extent of his other possible crimes without allowing speculation to replace evidence. The first question had a much clearer path. Benjamin Pitzel had been Holmes's associate in a fraudulent insurance scheme. The intended arrangement depended on creating the appearance of a death. Instead, Pitzel actually died. Holmes remained connected to the insurance arrangement and benefited from the circumstances surrounding it. Then Holmes became responsible for information about Pitzel's children, who disappeared and were later found dead. The sequence created a powerful chain of circumstances. Holmes's explanations had to be measured against the facts investigators were uncovering. And the more investigators learned, the more difficult it became for him to control the story. Holmes had spent years relying on deception. He had used names and identities to separate himself from aspects of his past. He had built relationships with people who trusted him. He had presented himself as educated and respectable. But investigations work differently from personal relationships. A person can lie to another individual. It is much harder to maintain the same lie when independent investigators compare documents, locations, movements, financial arrangements, and physical evidence. This was the challenge Holmes now faced. The investigation into the Pitzel family had created precisely that kind of comparison. Holmes could say the children were safe. Frank Geyer could follow their trail. Holmes could explain a death as suicide or as part of a fraudulent plan. Investigators could examine the circumstances and ask whether the explanation was consistent with the evidence. Holmes could create a story, but he could not control every fact that existed outside the story. Another complication involved the many other people who had disappeared from Holmes's life. Their names increasingly appeared in public discussions of the case. Julia Connor and her daughter Pearl had disappeared. Emmeline Sigrand had disappeared. Minnie and Nanny Williams had disappeared. These cases were suspicious because of Holmes's relationships with the people involved, but the evidence did not establish their deaths with the same certainty as Benjamin Pitzel's. This created a difficult situation for investigators and later historians. If Holmes was capable of murder, then his involvement in these disappearances could not simply be ignored. But suspicion could not be treated as proof. The same caution applied to the enormous number of alleged victims that would eventually become part of the Holmes legend. Holmes himself would later make claims about killing numerous people. Newspapers would publish sensational figures. Some accounts would suggest more than 100 victims, even more than 200. But those claims were not reliable enough to establish a factual victim count. Some people Holmes claimed to have killed were later found to be alive. His statements, therefore, had to be treated cautiously. He may have mixed truth with exaggeration, but the available information does not allow every confession to be accepted as fact. This uncertainty was particularly important because Holmes appeared to understand the power of his own story. Even after his arrest, he could influence public perception simply by making claims about what he had done. The more horrifying the claim, the more attention it attracted. The result was a strange reversal. A man who had spent his life manipulating people could continue manipulating the public even after his criminal activities had begun to collapse. The murder castle became central to that manipulation. Its strange construction allowed the public to imagine an almost perfectly organized system of murder. But the real Holmes did not need to be an architectural genius to be dangerous. His strongest weapon was deception. He could convince people that a false identity was real, that a fraudulent transaction was legitimate, or that a dangerous situation was harmless. The investigation was now exposing the limitations of that method. One of the most significant developments came from Frank Geyer's work. His pursuit of the children demonstrated that investigators could reconstruct Holmes's movements independently. Geyer did not need Holmes to tell him where the children had gone. He followed the trail himself. The discovery in Toronto, therefore, represented more than the recovery of bodies. It was proof that Holmes's version of events could be challenged through independent investigation. That principle would carry into the courtroom. By the time Holmes was brought toward trial, the prosecution had a specific victim and a specific charge. He would face trial in Philadelphia for the murder of Benjamin Pitzel. The case did not require prosecutors to prove that Holmes had murdered every person whose disappearance had ever been associated with him. It did not require them to prove that every feature of the Chicago building had been designed as a weapon. It required them to demonstrate Holmes's responsibility for Pittesell's death. That was a much narrower question, but it was also one supported by a much stronger evidentiary foundation. Holmes's arrest in 1894 had initially been connected to fraud. Over time, the investigation had expanded into murder. The deaths of the children had made the situation even more serious. By 1895, Holmes was no longer simply a suspect in an insurance scheme. He was a defendant facing a capital murder charge. The investigation had also revealed something about the way Holmes operated. His crimes, were proven, did not depend on a single elaborate mechanism. They depended on relationships. He needed people to trust him. He needed them to accept his explanations. He needed institutions to believe documents and stories that were false. And he needed time. The Pittesell case showed what happened when that system failed. Benjamin Pittesell's death created a fact that could not be undone. The children's deaths created another. Frank Geyer's investigation connected those facts through a trail Holmes had attempted to control. And now the courtroom would become the place where those facts would be tested. Holmes had one final opportunity to present his own version of events. He would attempt to defend himself and maintain control over the narrative. But unlike the people he had deceived privately, the jurors would hear the evidence in a formal proceeding. They would not simply be asked to trust Holmes. They would be asked to judge whether the evidence established his guilt. The strange building in Chicago had already become a national symbol of horror. But the case that could send Holmes to the gallows rested on something much more concrete: the death of Benjamin Pittesell and the chain of events that followed it. The investigation had finally reached the point where Holmes could no longer hide behind the mystery of his identity. The name Herman Webster Mudgett had been replaced by H. Holmes, but the courtroom would now have to determine what the man behind both names had actually done. By the time H. Holmes stood before a court in Philadelphia, the story surrounding him had already grown far beyond the specific charge he faced. Newspapers had transformed the strange building in Chicago into the infamous murder castle. Stories circulated about hidden rooms, secret mechanisms, and an enormous number of alleged victims. Holmes himself had contributed to the confusion by making claims about people he supposedly had killed. But the courtroom was not a newspaper office, and the prosecution did not need to prove every rumor that had become attached to his name. The central question was much narrower and far more important. Was H. Holmes responsible for the murder of Benjamin Pittesell? The trial began in October 1895, with Holmes facing prosecution for Pittesell's death. The case had developed from an insurance fraud scheme into a murder investigation, and the evidence surrounding that transformation formed the heart of the prosecution's argument. Holmes and Pittesell had been associates in fraudulent activities. Their plan had involved creating the appearance of Pittesell's death so that insurance money could be obtained. But Pittesell had not remained alive to participate in the deception. He had actually died. That fact stood at the center of everything that followed. The prosecution's task was to establish that Pittesell's death was not simply an unfortunate accident or a voluntary act connected to the fraudulent plan, but a murder for which Holmes was responsible. Holmes did not approach the trial like a defendant who intended to remain silent. Instead, he attempted to control the story himself. One of the most remarkable aspects of his defense was his decision to largely represent himself. Rather than relying entirely on a lawyer to present his case, Holmes sought to shape the narrative personally. This decision reflected a characteristic that had appeared repeatedly throughout his life: confidence in his ability to persuade other people. Holmes had spent years convincing people to accept false identities, financial arrangements, and explanations. Now he attempted to use those same abilities in court, but a courtroom presented a different challenge. The evidence was no longer being presented to a single person who might accept Holmes's assurances. It was being examined through a formal legal process, with a jury responsible for deciding whether the prosecution had established guilt. Holmes continued to offer explanations that attempted to reduce his responsibility for Pitzel's death. The original insurance scheme gave him a framework through which he could argue that Pitzel's death was connected to the fraudulent plan rather than a deliberate murder. Holmes also tried to suggest alternative explanations for what had happened, but the prosecution could point to the circumstances surrounding the death and to Holmes's financial interest in the insurance arrangement. The contradiction remained at the heart of the case. Pitzel was supposed to appear dead as part of a fraud, but instead he had actually died, while Holmes remained in a position to benefit from the insurance money. The prosecution could therefore present the scheme not as an innocent plan that had unexpectedly failed, but as the context in which Pitzel's death occurred. The disappearance of Pitzel's children added another disturbing dimension to the story. Alice, Nellie, and Howard had disappeared after their father's death. Holmes had controlled information about their whereabouts and had assured the family that they were safe. Investigator Frank Geyer had then followed the trail and found the children's bodies in Toronto. Their deaths were not themselves the specific murder charge being tried at that moment, but they formed part of the broader circumstances surrounding Holmes's conduct. They demonstrated that Holmes's involvement with the Pitzel family had continued after Benjamin's death. The children had not simply vanished independently of him. Their movements were connected to him, and the investigation had traced them through locations associated with his activities. For the prosecution, this broader context helped demonstrate the seriousness of Holmes's relationship with the Pitzel family. For the defense, however, the challenge was to prevent that context from becoming an assumption of guilt. The trial required the jury to focus on what could be proved. Holmes could not be convicted merely because he appeared suspicious or because newspapers had portrayed him as a monster. The prosecution needed to connect him to the specific killing of Benjamin Pitzel. This was why the evidence surrounding the insurance scheme mattered so much. It provided a financial motive and placed Holmes directly in the circumstances surrounding Pitzel's death. The investigation had also undermined Holmes's explanations. When he claimed that the children were safe, Geyer's investigation ultimately demonstrated otherwise. When the circumstances of Pitzel's death were examined, the original explanation became increasingly difficult to accept. The more contradictions investigators discovered, the more difficult it became for Holmes to maintain a consistent account. Yet the trial was not simply a battle between two stories. It was also a test of credibility. Holmes had created a reputation around his ability to persuade others. But credibility in court depended on more than confidence. His statements had to withstand the evidence. A contradiction that might be overlooked in a private conversation could become significant when compared with physical discoveries and independently established facts. The prosecution could point to what Holmes had said and then demonstrate what investigators had found. This process weakened the structure of his defense. Another important issue was the enormous amount of attention surrounding the murder castle. The public wanted the courtroom to explain the mystery surrounding the building. They wanted to know whether it had really been a place designed for systematic murder. But the trial could not simply become a referendum on the sensational stories printed in newspapers. The strange construction of Holmes's building was part of his reputation, but it was not the foundation of the murder conviction. Investigators had examined the building and reportedly discovered suspicious material, including 2 graves in the basement. Yet those discoveries did not establish the sensational claims that Holmes had murdered hundreds of people there. The prosecution's strongest case remained the specific death of Benjamin Pitzel. This distinction would later become crucial to the historical understanding of Holmes. He was not convicted of murdering 200 people. He was not convicted of every disappearance associated with him. He was convicted of killing Benjamin Pitzel. On November 2nd, 1895, the jury found Holmes guilty of Pitzel's murder. The verdict represented the collapse of the defense he had attempted to construct around the insurance scheme. The man who had planned to profit from a false death was now convicted of causing a real one. Holmes was sentenced to death, but even after the verdict, the story did not end. Holmes continued to shape his public image, and the question of how many people he had actually killed remained unresolved. During his imprisonment, he made claims about numerous murders. Some accounts attributed extraordinarily high numbers to him, while other versions of his statements placed the number at 27 or 28. But these confessions could not be accepted without scrutiny. Some people Holmes claimed to have killed were later known to be alive. That fact alone demonstrated why his statements had to be treated cautiously. A confession from Holmes could not automatically be considered evidence simply because it was horrifying. It had to be compared with independent facts. The same caution applied to the alleged victims associated with his Chicago years. Julia Connor, Pearl Connor, Emmeline Sigrand, Minnie Williams, and Nanny Williams remained part of the mystery surrounding Holmes. But their cases did not carry the same level of proof as the Pitzel murder. Holmes's conviction therefore established something specific, but not everything that later generations would associate with his name. He was a convicted murderer and fraudster. The case against him was real, but the enormous mythology surrounding him extended far beyond what had been demonstrated in court. This distinction also changed the meaning of the murder castle. The building had become a symbol of the crimes, but the trial did not prove that it had been a perfectly engineered machine for killing dozens or hundreds of people. Much of that image came from sensational journalism and later retellings. The courtroom instead revealed a more direct and disturbing reality. Holmes did not need an elaborate architectural death trap to commit fraud and murder. He needed a victim he could manipulate, a financial opportunity, and a story that others might believe. Benjamin Pitzel became the person at the center of that system. His death exposed the fraud, and the deaths of his children revealed the consequences that followed. The verdict therefore marked a significant moment not only in the legal history of Holmes, but also in the history of his legend. The jury had answered one question. Holmes was guilty of murdering Benjamin Pitzel. But countless other questions remained unanswered. What had happened to Julia Connor? What had happened to Emmeline Sigrand? What had happened to Minnie and Nanny Williams? How many of Holmes's own claims were true? And how much of the terrifying murder castle story had been created by newspapers after the facts were already known? Holmes would never provide reliable answers to all of these questions. Instead, he continued to surround himself with contradictory statements, leaving behind a case in which the boundary between proven crime and sensational legend would remain contested for generations. Yet one fact could no longer be disputed. Benjamin Pitzel was dead, and the man who had entered into a fraudulent scheme with him had been found legally responsible for his murder. On May 7, 1896, H. Holmes would face the final consequence of that conviction. The execution would close the legal case against him, but it would not close the mystery. The questions surrounding the missing women, the children, the Chicago building, and Holmes's own claims would survive him. And that unfinished story would eventually become one of the most enduring legends in American true crime. After his conviction for the murder of Benjamin Pitzel on November 2, 1895, H. Holmes entered the final stage of his life. Legally, the central question had been answered. The jury had found him guilty, and he had been sentenced to death. Yet the mystery surrounding Holmes was far from over. In some ways, the period between his conviction and execution made the story even more complicated. Holmes continued to speak about his crimes, and the statements attributed to him became part of the mythology that would surround his name long after his death. He claimed responsibility for numerous killings, sometimes giving figures that were extraordinarily high. Other versions of his confessions placed the number at 27 or 28 victims. Newspapers and later accounts would push the numbers even further, sometimes suggesting that Holmes had killed more than 100 people or even more than 200. But the problem was that Holmes's own statements could not be treated as reliable records. His history was built around deception, and his claims about murder were not consistently supported by independent evidence. Some people he claimed to have killed were later found to be alive. That fact is crucial. It demonstrates that Holmes was capable of making statements about murders that had not actually occurred. Once that became clear, every other confession had to be viewed with caution. A man who had already spent years manipulating identities, documents, and financial schemes could also manipulate the story of his own crimes. The possibility that he exaggerated his crimes for attention, notoriety, or some other purpose cannot be separated from the historical record. This is one reason the true number of Holmes's victims remains unknown. It is tempting to choose a single figure and present it as fact, especially because the popular image of Holmes depends upon the idea of a mass murderer responsible for an extraordinary number of deaths. But the evidence does not support that certainty. What can be established with the greatest confidence is much narrower. Benjamin Pitezel was murdered, and Holmes was convicted of that murder. 3 of Pitezel's children, Alice, Nellie, and Howard, were also found dead after Holmes had controlled information about their movements, giving investigators strong reason to connect their deaths to him. Other people connected to Holmes, including Julia Connor, Pearl Connor, Emmeline Sigrand, Minnie Williams, and Nanny Williams, remained surrounded by suspicion, but their cases could not be established with the same degree of certainty. Holmes's final statements, therefore, created a strange contradiction. They made him appear more terrifying while simultaneously making the historical truth harder to determine. Every additional claim could have been another piece of evidence, but every false or exaggerated claim weakened the reliability of the entire confession. The public wanted a monster with a precise number attached to his crimes. The historical record offered something far more uncertain. Holmes had been convicted of murder, but the full extent of his violence could not be measured simply by repeating his own words. During this period, the image of the murder castle also became increasingly powerful. The building in Chicago had already become associated with stories of secret rooms, hidden passages, gas lines, traps, and elaborate methods of killing and disposing of bodies. But later historical examination has shown that many of these details were exaggerated or lacked reliable evidence. The building itself had been unusual, and investigators had discovered suspicious material there, including 2 graves in the basement. But there is no firm basis for treating every sensational description of the building as fact. The idea that Holmes constructed the entire building solely as a giant machine for murdering unsuspecting visitors is part of the mythology, not an established conclusion. This distinction matters because Holmes's actual crimes were serious enough without adding details. That cannot be proved. His fraud was real. His relationship with Benjamin Pitezel was real. The insurance scheme was real. Pitezel's death was real. The deaths of the children were real. His conviction was real. Those facts form a story that does not require invention. The execution date approached. Holmes had been sentenced to death in Philadelphia, and on May 7, 1896, he was taken to the gallows. He was not yet 35 years old. The legal punishment was for the murder of Benjamin Pitezel, the crime for which the jury had convicted him. It is important to remember what the execution did and did not resolve. It ended Holmes's ability to commit further crimes. It also ended the possibility of bringing him to trial for other suspected offenses. But it did not answer the unresolved questions surrounding the people who had disappeared from his life. If Holmes had been responsible for the deaths of Julia Connor, Pearl Connor, Emmeline Sigrand, Minnie Williams, or Nanny Williams, those cases would never receive the same legal conclusion as the Pitezel murder. His death therefore closed one chapter, while leaving other chapters unfinished. The same was true of the larger question of the alleged victim count. Holmes could no longer be questioned in a courtroom about every claim he had made. Future investigators and historians would have to evaluate his statements against whatever independent evidence remained. The result was inevitable uncertainty. On May 7, 1896, H. Holmes was hanged in Philadelphia. The man who had spent years creating identities and manipulating other people's trust had reached the end of his ability to control events. His execution was the final legal consequence of Benjamin Pittizal's murder. Yet even at that moment, the name H.H. Holmes had already begun to separate into two different figures: the man established by the evidence and the monster created by legend. The historical Holmes was a fraudster who became a convicted murderer. He was involved in insurance deception. He manipulated people around him. He was connected to the deaths of members of the Pittizal family. The legendary Holmes was something larger, a calculating mass murderer who supposedly designed an elaborate building to kill countless strangers. The two images overlapped, but they were not identical. The second image became far more famous than the first. In the years after Holmes's death, the story of the murder castle continued to grow. The building itself would eventually disappear. It was damaged by fire in 1895 and was ultimately demolished in 1938. With the physical structure gone, the story surrounding it became even easier to reshape. There was no longer a building that could be examined directly. There were only descriptions, newspaper accounts, historical records, and later retellings. Each generation could add another layer to the legend. The absence of the building helped turn it into something almost symbolic, a place that represented the darkest possible version of the Holmes story. Yet the disappearance of the building also meant that historians had to rely even more heavily on the surviving evidence. That evidence does not support every famous claim. The number of 200 victims, for example, cannot be treated as established fact. Holmes's own statements cannot bear that weight because they contain demonstrably unreliable claims. The same caution must be applied to stories about every room in the building. A terrifying detail is not necessarily a true detail. A newspaper headline is not necessarily an investigative finding. And an allegation is not the same as a conviction. This is perhaps the most important lesson of the Holmes case. True crime can become distorted when the desire for a frightening story becomes stronger than the evidence. Holmes himself may have understood that better than anyone. He had spent his life manipulating perception. Even after his conviction, he remained capable of influencing the public by presenting himself as a man with terrible secrets. Every confession added to his reputation. Every sensational claim made the legend larger. And once those stories entered newspapers, they could survive long after the facts had become difficult to verify. The victims, meanwhile, risked disappearing behind the image of the killer. Benjamin Pittizal could become merely the man Holmes murdered. Alice, Nellie, and Howard could become names in a list of alleged victims. The women connected to Holmes could become mysterious figures in a larger legend. But they were people whose lives were affected by Holmes's actions. Whether their deaths can ultimately be proven or not. The most responsible way to tell the story is therefore to keep the focus on what can actually be established. Holmes was not merely a fictional villain created by newspapers. He was a real criminal who committed real fraud and was convicted of a real murder. At the same time, he was not proven responsible for every death later attributed to him. The truth lies between those extremes. His execution on May 7, 1896, ended the life of Herman Webster Mudgett, the man who had lived under the name H.H. Holmes. But it did not provide a final answer to the central mystery. How many people did he actually kill? That question remains unresolved. What is certain is that Holmes used deception as a way of gaining money and controlling other people, and that the fraudulent scheme involving Benjamin Pittizal ended in murder. The deaths of Pittizal's children exposed the terrible consequences of that relationship. The trial established Holmes's guilt. The execution ended the legal case. Everything beyond that remains a matter of evidence, uncertainty, and historical interpretation. And perhaps that is what makes the Holmes story so enduring. The most frightening part is not necessarily the legend of a perfect murder castle. It is the documented reality of a man who understood how easily trust could be manipulated and how devastating the consequences could become when that trust was placed in the wrong hands. By the time H.H. Holmes was executed on May 7, 1896, the facts of his case had already begun to merge with something larger, a legend. Holmes had been convicted of murdering Benjamin Pitzel, and the deaths of Pitzel's 3 children had provided some of the strongest evidence connecting Holmes to a wider pattern of violence. But the public story did not stop there. It continued to expand around the strange building in Chicago, the unexplained disappearances of people associated with Holmes, and the extraordinary claims Holmes himself had made about the number of people he had supposedly killed. In the years that followed, these different elements became increasingly difficult to separate. The name H.H. Holmes became almost synonymous with the phrase murder castle, and the building became more famous than many of the people whose lives had been destroyed. Yet the historical record requires a more careful distinction. There was a real building. There were real crimes. There was a real murder conviction. There were real deaths connected strongly to Holmes. But there was also a vast layer of speculation that developed around those facts. One of the most persistent claims was that Holmes had murdered more than 100 people, with some accounts suggesting more than 200. That number became part of the popular identity of Holmes, but it cannot be established from the evidence available. Holmes himself contributed to the confusion. He made statements claiming responsibility for numerous killings, but those statements were inconsistent and included people who were later found to be alive. Once that was known, his confessions could no longer be accepted as a straightforward record of his crimes. A confession normally appears to provide certainty. In Holmes's case, it often produced another question: which parts were true? This uncertainty affected the entire historical understanding of his alleged victims. Julia Connor and her daughter Pearl had disappeared after Julia's relationship with Holmes. Emmeline Sigrand had also disappeared after working for him. Minnie Williams and her sister Nanny were connected to Holmes through personal and financial relationships and later disappeared. These cases remain deeply suspicious because of Holmes's connections to the people involved. But suspicion is not equivalent to proof. The same principle applies to other names that were later attached to the Holmes story. A person disappearing while connected to Holmes does not, by itself, establish that Holmes murdered that person. The temptation to connect every unexplained disappearance to a notorious killer is powerful, especially when the killer himself has claimed responsibility for many deaths. But responsible historical analysis requires resisting that temptation. The strongest evidence remains concentrated around the Pitzel family. Benjamin Pitzel was the victim whose murder led to Holmes's conviction. Alice, Nellie, and Howard Pitzel were the children whose deaths were discovered after Holmes had controlled their movements and assured others that they were safe. Those deaths formed the clearest foundation for understanding the actual danger Holmes represented. The Chicago building presents a similar problem. It became known as the Murder Castle, but that name itself reflects the way the story developed after Holmes's crimes became public. The building had unusual features, and investigators found suspicious material there. 2 graves were reportedly discovered in the basement in July 1895. But the existence of unusual rooms or unexplained features does not prove that the building was designed as a gigantic killing machine. Many of the most dramatic descriptions associated with the building came through sensational journalism. Stories of elaborate gas systems, secret passages, trapdoors, rooms designed specifically for murder, and sophisticated mechanisms for disposing of bodies became part of the public imagination. Yet later historical research has challenged many of these claims. The building may have been connected more closely to Holmes's fraudulent commercial activities than to a perfectly organized system of mass murder. Holmes was known for manipulating contractors and suppliers, changing workers, and obtaining materials without properly paying for them. The disorder and unusual construction of the building may therefore have reflected his financial schemes rather than a single grand design for killing people. This does not make the building ordinary. It simply means that the truth was more complicated than the legend. The building became an object onto which the public could project every terrifying story about Holmes. Because it no longer exists, the mythology has become even harder to challenge visually. The structure was damaged by fire in 1895 and eventually demolished in 1938. With its destruction, the physical evidence disappeared from the landscape. What remained were descriptions, records, photographs, newspaper stories, and later interpretations. Over time, the absence of the building itself allowed the image of the murder castle to become almost limitless. It could be described as a maze because nobody could walk through it anymore. It could be imagined as a sophisticated death trap because its actual structure was no longer available for ordinary examination. The legend grew in the space left by the vanished building. But the victims should not disappear in the same way. The danger of focusing too heavily on the architecture is that the story can become centered on the killer's environment rather than the people who suffered because of him. Benjamin Pitezel becomes secondary to the building. Alice, Nellie, and Howard become secondary to the mystery. The women whose disappearances remain unresolved become characters in a ghost story instead of people whose lives deserve to be remembered with care. A responsible account must reverse that emphasis. Holmes's importance in history does not come from how frightening a building could be made to sound. It comes from what he actually did to other human beings. His manipulation of trust was central to his criminal behavior. He created identities. He used false documents. He became involved in financial schemes. He established relationships that could provide access to money and property. And in the case of Benjamin Pitezel, the fraudulent system ended in a real death. That is more significant than any exaggerated description of a hidden room. Holmes did not need to kill hundreds of people for his crimes to be horrifying. One murder was enough to make the legal case against him. The deaths of the Pitezel children made the consequences even more devastating. The unresolved cases add another layer of tragedy because the truth may never be completely recovered. Holmes was executed in 1896, so investigators could no longer question him about every disappearance. His death closed the possibility of future prosecution and left historical questions permanently incomplete. This is another reason why certainty about the total number of victims is impossible. Some cases may have involved Holmes. Others may have had completely different explanations. Without sufficient evidence, it is impossible to know. Holmes's own statements cannot fill those gaps because his credibility was already compromised. The man who had built his criminal life around deception had also created an unreliable record of his own alleged murders. That irony is central to understanding the legacy of the case. Holmes wanted to control what other people believed. He succeeded in doing so during much of his life. He also succeeded, to some extent, after his death. His stories became part of the public record, even when they were unsupported. The more shocking the claim, the more likely it was to survive. Eventually, the phrase, H. Holmes killed hundreds, became easier to remember than the more complicated truth. Holmes was convicted of one murder, strongly connected to the deaths of 3 children, suspected in several other disappearances, and surrounded by a large body of unverified claims. The difference between those statements is enormous. One creates a simple monster. The other describes an unresolved historical case. And unresolved cases are often more difficult to tell because they require patience. They require the narrator to say, "We do not know." They require separating the evidence from the legend. They require accepting that some questions may never have answers. The Holmes case is therefore not only a story about murder. It is also a story about how crime becomes mythology. Newspapers transformed a criminal investigation into a national spectacle. Holmes's own claims expanded the mystery. Later generations repeated the most dramatic details. Eventually, the legend became so familiar that questioning it could seem like questioning the entire case. But the evidence remains the foundation. Benjamin Pitezel was real. His children were real. Their deaths were real. Frank Geyer's investigation was real. Holmes's conviction was real. His execution was real. The rest must be evaluated carefully. That does not diminish the horror of the case. It makes the story more honest. In the end, perhaps the most revealing part of Holmes's legacy is not the number of alleged victims or the architecture of the murder castle. It is the contrast between appearance and reality. Holmes presented himself as a respectable, educated man. Behind that identity was a person deeply involved in deception and fraud, a man who was ultimately convicted of murder. He understood how easily people could be persuaded to trust appearances. More than a century later, his case presents the same challenge to those who tell the story. We, too, must decide what to believe. The difference is that we now have the responsibility to question the sensational version and return to the evidence. Holmes's story survived because it was frightening. It endured because it was mysterious. But the people at its center deserve something more than a legend. They deserve the truth that can still be established, and the honesty to acknowledge everything that cannot. More than a century after H. Holmes was executed, the questions surrounding his crimes remain remarkably difficult to answer. The passage of time has not produced a definitive list of victims. Instead, it has made the distinction between evidence and legend even more important. Holmes remains one of the most recognizable names in American true crime, but the historical record is narrower than the popular story suggests. He was Herman Webster Mudgett, a man who adopted the name H. Holmes and built a life around deception, fraudulent schemes, false identities, and manipulation. He became involved in an insurance scheme with Benjamin Pitezel, and that scheme ended with Pitezel's actual death. Holmes was eventually convicted of that murder and executed on May 7, 1896. Those facts are firm. Beyond them, however, the story becomes increasingly complicated. The three Pitezel children, Alice, Nellie, and Howard, were found dead after Holmes had controlled their movements and told others they were safe. Their deaths provide strong evidence of a connection between Holmes and the tragedy that followed. Their father's murder. Investigator Frank Geyer traced their movements and discovered their bodies in Toronto in July 1895. That investigation remains one of the most significant parts of the case because it demonstrated the importance of following evidence rather than accepting Holmes's explanations. His statements could be challenged by physical facts. He could say that the children were safe, but investigators found them dead. He could offer explanations about the fraudulent insurance arrangement, but Benjamin Pitezel was still dead. The more investigators checked his story against reality, the less convincing it became. The case also leaves behind several women whose disappearances remain uncertain. Julia Connor and her daughter Pearl were connected to Holmes through his personal relationship with Julia. Emmeline Sigrin had worked for him before disappearing. Minnie Williams and Nanny Williams were connected to Holmes through personal and financial relationships and later disappeared. These cases are among the reasons Holmes became associated with a much larger number of possible victims. Yet there is a critical difference between suspicion and proof. The available evidence does not allow every disappearance connected to Holmes to be described as a confirmed murder. Some may have been, others may have had different explanations. Without sufficient evidence, history cannot provide certainty. This uncertainty is not a weakness in the story. It is part of the story. The same principle applies to the famous number of victims attributed to Holmes. Claims of more than 100 or even more than 200 victims have become deeply embedded in popular culture. But those figures are not established facts. Holmes himself made claims about numerous murders, sometimes providing numbers that varied depending on the account. Some of the people he claimed to have killed were later found to be alive. That single fact is enough to demonstrate why his confessions must be treated with caution. A person can confess to a crime that never happened. In Holmes's case, his statements may have contained genuine admissions mixed with exaggeration, invention, or manipulation, because there is no reliable way to separate every true claim from every false one. His alleged victim count remains unresolved. This also changes how we should understand the murder castle. The phrase has become so familiar that it can be difficult to remember that it was not a neutral description of a building. It was part of a story that developed through sensational reporting. Holmes's Chicago property did have unusual characteristics, and investigators reportedly discovered suspicious material there, including 2 graves in the basement. But the evidence does not prove that every dramatic feature later attributed to the building actually existed or was designed for murder. Stories of gas-filled rooms, secret passages, elaborate traps, and sophisticated systems for disposing of bodies became part of the Holmes mythology. Some may have been based on real features, while others were exaggerated or invented through sensational journalism. The distinction matters because the murder castle has sometimes overshadowed the actual investigation. It is easier to imagine a terrifying building than to understand a complicated fraud that developed through relationships and deception. Yet the latter is closer to the evidence. Holmes's criminal activity depended heavily on trust. He could present himself as respectable. He could use another name. He could make business arrangements appear legitimate. He could convince people that a false story was true. His education and appearance helped create an image of credibility. His methods were not necessarily dependent on a single architectural masterpiece. They depended on people believing him. That reality makes the Pitzel case especially significant. The insurance scheme created an opportunity for Holmes to profit from what was supposed to be a fictional death. But Benjamin Pitzel actually died. The scheme therefore crossed a line from fraud into murder. After Pitzel's death, Holmes continued to manipulate information about the family. The disappearance and deaths of the children made the consequences even more devastating. The investigation exposed the danger not because detectives discovered an enormous machine designed to kill hundreds, but because they followed a sequence of human relationships, movements, statements, and deaths. This is one of the reasons Frank Geyer's role is so important. He followed the trail when Holmes's explanations could no longer be trusted. His investigation demonstrated that the truth could be reconstructed even when the person at the center of the case was determined to conceal it. The search crossed locations and eventually reached Toronto. There, the discovery of the children established a reality that Holmes could not explain away. The victims themselves provide another reason for caution when telling the story. True crime can easily become centered on the offender, especially when the offender has deliberately cultivated an extraordinary persona. Holmes's name has survived for generations. The names of the people harmed by him are far less familiar. The murder castle has become famous. The lives connected to it have often become footnotes. That imbalance is important to correct. Benjamin Pitzel was not simply evidence in a murder trial. He was a person whose relationship with Holmes ended in death. Alice, Nellie, and Howard were not merely part of a detective's trail. They were children whose lives ended after being placed under Holmes's control. Julia Connor, Pearl Connor, Emmeline Sigrand, Minnie Williams, and Nanny Williams should also be remembered not merely as mysterious names, but as people whose disappearances remain unresolved in the historical record. Even when a murder cannot be conclusively established, the uncertainty surrounding a disappearance is itself significant. It reminds us of the limits of the evidence that survives. The physical building also reflects those limits. It was damaged by fire in 1895 and eventually demolished in 1938. Today, the murder castle no longer stands. Its disappearance has allowed its mythology to grow even larger because the building cannot be directly examined as it once existed. What remains are historical records and competing accounts. The absence of the structure makes it even more important to resist treating every later description as fact. A true crime story should not become more certain simply because it becomes older. In fact, the opposite can happen. As evidence disappears and witnesses die, later generations may inherit stories without knowing which parts were originally documented and which were added afterward. Holmes's case illustrates this problem perfectly. The sensational image of the mass murderer has survived more strongly than the more limited but better supported historical record. Yet the documented record is disturbing enough. Holmes was a professional fraudster. He manipulated people and financial systems. He participated in an insurance scheme with Benjamin Pitzel. Pitzel died. Holmes was convicted of his murder. The Pitzel children later died after being moved under Holmes's control. Holmes was executed. These facts alone establish a serious criminal history. There is no need to inflate the number of victims to make the case horrifying. In fact, exaggeration risks doing something deeply unfair. It turns real suffering into entertainment and allows the legend of the killer to overshadow the people who were harmed. The most responsible conclusion is therefore not that Holmes was harmless outside the one murder for which he was convicted, nor is it that every disappearance connected to him must have been one of his murders. The truth lies between those extremes. He was unquestionably a dangerous criminal. The evidence strongly connects him to the deaths within the Pitzel case. Other cases remain suspicious but unresolved. His own claims about additional victims cannot be accepted without independent confirmation. And the famous image of the murder castle must be treated with historical caution. What remains after all the sensational details are removed is a story about deception, trust, financial exploitation, murder, and the devastating consequences suffered by people who became entangled with Holmes. His life ended at the gallows in Philadelphia, but the questions surrounding him did not. Perhaps they never will. History sometimes provides complete answers. In the Holmes case, it provides fragments. Some fragments fit together with remarkable clarity. Others remain separated by uncertainty. The responsible task is not to fill those gaps with imagination, but to leave them visible. That is where the real story ends, not with a perfect count of victims, not with an infallible map of a legendary murder house, but with the evidence that survives and the people whose lives were changed forever by Herman Webster Mudgett, the man who called himself H. Holmes.